is David Trimble. I serve as the Vice President for Public Policy and Director of the Center for Religious Freedom Education at the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. Is religious freedom the creation of the West? Is religious freedom part of a political framework created by America's founders, intended actually to restrict freedom of thought and drive individuals and communities toward one faith tradition? Is religious freedom a front for hatred and bigotry? Or is it in truth, when properly understood, a fundamental, inalienable, and in fact, universal human right? I hope in the next several minutes to touch upon some topics that provide partial answers, or at least stir an interest for you to research these questions further. Now, to be sure, from the founding of America, the protection of religious freedom has been sacred to our nation. The First Amendment to the Constitution, ratified on December 15, 1791, secures the right to religious freedom for every American and every religious community. From our inception, that fundamental right was viewed as an essential pillar of stability for American society, despite our many differences as a melting pot of pluralism. So historically, religious freedom in its fullest and its most vigorous expression emerged with the birth of our nation and the drafting of the Constitution. Its critical importance to the founding of America and to the flourishing of our democracy over the next 2 centuries is woven into the DNA of America. But does that mean that religious freedom is solely an American ideal? To answer this question, I want to use that date of ratification for the First Amendment, December 15, 1791, as a fulcrum. And from that fulcrum or point of support for our discussion, I want us to look back, albeit very briefly, and I want us to look forward. That is from December 1791, then forward in time. First, as we look back, this question has been answered in part, at least in previous lessons. One reason America's founders prioritized religious freedom as a bedrock principle upon which to build our democracy is that it, that is religious freedom, is grounded in an unshakable affirmation of the intrinsic value of every person. We learn from sociologists and anthropologists that every society on earth has elements of religion embedded within it. The founders' understanding of religious freedom reflected a basic truth about humankind, namely that religion and the right to its free exercise are rooted not in a political construct, but in human nature. All people deserve to understand it is natural to seek truth about a reality greater than themselves. They may perceive truth in one of the world's religions, or they may choose to embrace no religion at all. But the bedrock freedom to follow the dictates of their own religious conscience is inalienable and should not be repressed on our soil or on any other. It is a fundamental right afforded every individual based on his or her intrinsic dignity. Now, second, going back to that fulcrum, that point of departure for our discussion, and now looking ahead. Following the ratification of the First Amendment in 1791, the emergence of religious freedom as a universal ideal was very slow. For more than a century, the robust American model of religious freedom was not fully adopted anywhere, even by other democracies. However, in the years following World War II, religious freedom began to emerge as a universal ideal. There are likely several reasons why this was the case, but one primary reason was the broad revulsion at the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews. In response, a large number of international covenants and national constitutions were written to provide explicit protections for fundamental human rights, including religious freedom. As we examine the emergence of religious freedom as a universal ideal, I want to focus for a few moments on three phases of global engagement related to that topic. The first phase, global recognition that religious freedom is distinctively important. Shortly after the end of World War II, a global trend emerged that treats religious freedom in a fashion similar in some ways to the American founders. This was accomplished typically through the promulgation of a number of international laws and covenants. And within some of these laws, religious freedom is understood, first, as an important aspect of humanity. Second, a liberty that should be protected for all. And third, a freedom with a special character and dignity. During this period, perhaps the most detailed language closest to the principled understanding of America's founders is found in the Constitution of India, which defines the right to freedom of religion in this way. Quote, all persons are equally entitled to freedom of conscience and the right to freely profess, practice, and propagate religion, end quote. While this phase or period of recognition was encouraging, some countries like India and China, which created their own constitutions affirming religious freedom, are now actively engaged in religious persecution. The second phase of global engagement was marked by building global consensus about religious freedom as a universal human right. Within this phase, three actions stand out as most important for building the global consensus. The formation of the United Nations Human Rights Commission in 1947 and the approval in 1948 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations General Assembly by a vote of 48-0. The key language of the Declaration, of course, as it relates to religious freedom is Article 18, which reads, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. A second action toward building global consensus was the adoption of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights by the UN General Assembly in 1966. The ICCPR, which states in part that no one shall be subject to coercion which would impair his freedom to have or to adapt a religion or belief of his choice, was entered into force in 1976. The third action that was instrumental in building global consensus in support of religious freedom as a universal human right, and that was the action taken by the United Nations General Assembly in 1981, when they issued a declaration on the elimination of all forms of intolerance and of discrimination based on religion or belief. The third phase of global engagement is advancing religious freedom as a fundamental human right in U.S. foreign policy. Now, here, for the sake of time, I can only hit the high points, but I must do that. In 1998, the Bipartisan International Religious Freedom Act, also known as IRFA, was introduced by Republican Congressman Frank Wolf. It was overwhelmingly passed by both chambers of the U.S. Congress and signed into law. The goal of IRFA was to advance religious freedom in U.S. foreign policy as both a fundamental human right owed to every person and a source of flourishing and stability that can benefit all societies. In order to carry out this new international religious freedom policy, within the bill, Congress mandated the creation of the Office of International Religious Freedom within the State Department. They also created the position of Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, who heads up the IRF office at State. And they also created the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. In 2016, the International Religious Freedom Act was amended, passed by both chambers of Congress without a single dissenting vote, and signed into law. Among many important provisions, the Wolf Amendment of 2016 added new or strengthened existing reporting requirements about bad state actors who committed religious freedom violations. In 2018, Republican Chris Smith and Democrat Anna Eshoo co-sponsored a bill dedicated to the protection of ethnic and religious minorities persecuted by ISIS. That bill passed by both chambers of the U.S. Congress without a single vote of opposition and was signed into law. In closing, let us return to the question, is religious freedom solely an American ideal? We clearly see that it is not. From an anthropological and sociological point of view, religious freedom is rooted in human nature. From a legal perspective, through international declarations and covenants, and even through the lens of U.S. foreign policy, we come to see what the founders saw, that religious freedom is a fundamental, inalienable, and universal human right. Unfortunately, despite a better understanding of the critical role of religion in societies and the many provisions in law to support free exercise for everyone, everywhere, violent religious persecution is rapidly growing in many parts of the world today. Threats to religious freedom are even taking root at home. There is much work still to be done.